Our second reading is found in the Gospel according to Luke, chapter number 14, beginning with verse number 1. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or brothers and sisters or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. May God again bless the reading and hearing of this word, and may we hear in it a word that is to us and for us on this very day. Welsh poet Dylan Thomas is most famous for the line, "Do not go gentle into the good night." What a great line. He is almost as famous for this quote, "Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion." I want to go ahead and let the cat out of the bag about what this sermon is about this morning. It is pretty much captured by Dylan Thomas's quote. Every act of love is eternal. Every act of compassion, every act of kindness, every act which lifts up one who is down will live forever, and death can't touch it or diminish it. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion. I want us to think about that beyond its sentimental surface, and think about it in terms of the imperative calling upon the Christian family to love and to welcome in a radical fashion. The acts of love I'm asking you to consider are best considered in story. So let me tell you a story. It is the story of Richard Deaton. Richard Deaton was an acquaintance of mine. I can't call him a friend. We never quite crossed that line from knowing who the other was to actually knowing one another. And I'm rather certain that I'm responsible that we never crossed that line. I met Richard in the fall of 1974. I, along with my family, had just moved from Roswell, Georgia to Greensboro, North Carolina. A little background information is helpful here. I had a better childhood than most, or as I often tell people, I have nobody to blame. However, if there was a particular challenge inherent in my formative years, it was the fact that my father's occupation caused us to relocate frequently. Particularly in the first 12 years of my life, we moved about once a year. And so it meant creating a cycle of saying goodbye to friends and to school and to church, and then starting that cycle all over again. And I never thought of it as burdensome. It was just our life, and I didn't know any other way. I never thought of it as a burden, that is, until the fall of 1974. I was thinking of it as a burden, especially on the day that I met Richard. You see, this move had been different. I was particularly attached to my life in Roswell, Georgia. I liked my friends. I liked my school. I liked my youth league football team. I even liked the church that we picked out in Roswell. My grandparents were nearby. as was my very favorite aunt. When we moved to Greensboro, I, for the first time, resented this imposition upon my life. My discomfort was exasperated by the fact that when we moved to Greensboro, we were placed in a school that housed 7th through 12th graders all in the same building. So under any circumstances, as a 7th grader, I would have been on the low end of the social pecking order. But now I was not only a lowly 7th grader among all these giant juniors and seniors, I was feeling like a stranger in a strange land. Well, what I remember most about that first day of school was lunch in the cafeteria. Captured in that memory was the presence of a jukebox in the cafeteria, which was the one cool thing I found that day. Now, perhaps there are a few people here young enough to not know what jukeboxes are. Well, they existed in the dark ages of human existence, when we couldn't carry around all of our favorite music in our phone or on some other electronic device strapped to our bodies. Those were dark and difficult days, but we as human beings persevered and made our way through it with things like jukeboxes. It was 3 plays for a quarter, if I remember correctly, and the jukebox would drop those 45s into place. I don't have time to explain what 45s are. Well, when I walked into the cafeteria at Southern Guilford High School, the jukebox was playing Elton John's Crocodile Rock, a song which to this day takes me back to that day. Well, the coolness of having a jukebox in the cafeteria quickly faded when I looked around the room and observed all these strange faces which seemed very indifferent to the presence of a new kid at school. After making my way through the lunch line and paying my 35 cents for lunch, I found myself left with a dilemma. Where would I sit? Well, the prospect of attempting to sit at someone's table only to be told that the seat was saved for someone else was a terrible prospect, but not much less terrible than sitting at one of the 1 or 2 completely empty tables. Before panic could fully set in, and just as a terrible weight was about to settle in my chest, I heard my name from a few tables away. It was Richard, sitting there at the table with 2 or 3 others. I'd met Richard in my first class of the day. He sat behind me and had briefly introduced himself. Well, we'll call it relief, but I don't think the English language really has a word for the kind of relief that I felt when I saw Richard waving me over, pulling out the seat as a sign of welcome. He introduced me to his friends at the table, and while I remember nothing about the conversation, I do remember that while I still doubted whether or not I would survive this transition, I at least believe I would survive this first day in that terrible half hour in the cafeteria. There's something else you should know about Richard and I. We had nothing in common. Nothing. I liked sports, he liked working on cars. He was country, I was city. I would be expected by my family to take classes which would prepare me for college. He was expected by his family to take the shop and auto repair classes that would prepare him to take his place in his father's business. Well, given our seeming lack of compatibility and my efforts in the next 24 hours to make a few friends in the class that directly preceded lunch, I never faced that dilemma again of not having anywhere to sit. And Richard and I, well, we never sat together again either. We would continue to acknowledge one another in the hallways from time to time, but that was about it. And yet, some half a century later, that's how long it's been, it was his deed that came to mind when I read the gospel lesson this morning. You see, I believed on that day, I can laugh about it now, but I truly believed that I might suffer a mortal form of embarrassment. And he saved me from it. Though lovers be lost, love shall not, and death shall have no dominion. Every act of love is eternal. Every act of compassion, every act of kindness, every act which lifts up one who is down will live forever. And death can't touch it, and death can't diminish it. It isn't terribly difficult to connect the dots in terms of why this passage from Luke would trigger that nearly 50-year-old memory. On the surface, it appears as if Jesus has shifted from his function as a rabbi and has become some kind of ancient Middle Eastern Ann Landers. We find him giving advice about good table manners, about seating arrangements, and advice about how to put together a guest list for your dinners. If you go to dinner, Jesus said, don't grab the best seat. Don't grab the seat of honor. It's too risky. It sets you up for embarrassment in case the seat was meant for somebody more important than you. It creates the prospect for one of those, this seat was saved for somebody else. Instead, Jesus says, take the lowest and least valued seat. You've got nowhere to go but up. Just practical advice. His practical advice continues and is extended to party hosts. I have a few of those here. When he lays out the wild proposal that instead of crafting, get this, an invite list of friends and relatives and family and your wealthy friends and family, don't invite them. All of them can return the favor. Instead, Jesus says, invite the poor, the lame, the broken. Jesus suggests a guest list which includes those which wouldn't be on anybody else's guest list. Well, it's okay if you're thinking it, party host. Jesus' advice is crazy. Well, I think it's supposed to be. Jesus, we might be thinking, should stick to parables about God and heaven and sin and leave all the party planning advice to someone else. But we don't have to be New Testament Greek scholars to know that Jesus is talking about something else. This Jesus who was always turning things upside down, this Jesus who was always turning things inside out, this Jesus is up to it again, upending something. He is calling into question the social order which has no place of honor for the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. But let us be careful with this passage to pick up on a particular nuance. Jesus, this is important, doesn't denounce the system. Jesus does not denounce the system. A careful reading shows that he doesn't denounce this social system as it exists. He simply described it. He simply said, this is how it is. But wouldn't we expect the leader of our movement, wouldn't we expect Jesus to denounce the systems which create status for some while granting none to others? Wouldn't we expect Jesus to denounce the system which oppresses the lowly? Wouldn't we expect Jesus to denounce and show some red-faced indignation? I mean, come on, this is Jesus. About the social systems which exclude and keep the lowly in low positions. But he doesn't. At least not in this gospel moment. And all I can do is take a guess at why. I think it is because denouncement and indignation are at the end of the day the easy part. Denouncement and indignation are sometimes warranted. In fact, from my perch, looking at the world, they are often warranted. But nevertheless, that's the easy part. Now, let's not imagine today that this passage is meant to speak to less enlightened folk than you and I. It's always the temptation and the pitfalls with reading the Gospels and the parables of Jesus. We imagine them meant for someone else, but let's imagine that they meant to speak to you and I. I mean, we liberals are good at denouncement and indignation, aren't we? That's our shtick. I mean, give us an ism, any ism, and we know just how to formulate the words to express our denouncement of that ism and the indignation that it stirs in our souls. Give us an injustice, and people like me can get so energized by that in one sitting we can craft a sermon expressing our denouncement, describing in great detail the level of indignation that we are feeling. I've done it before, and well, I'm going to do it again. I've long had enough self-awareness to know that I do my best preaching when I'm just ticked off about something. I have something to denounce, some indignation to express. I only type with 2 fingers. But you give me something that's ticked me off, and man, that sermon come together. And sometimes we all need to do that. We need to find the prophet within us. We need to find the courage that it takes to expose evil, to name it. But still, I tell you, even if we find that courage, that's still the easy part. Now, here in this word from Luke's gospel, a call to get immersed in the more difficult part. Jesus doesn't denounce the social system of the day. Instead, he invites his people to live within it in a different way. Look, I understand the inclination to want to change the world. On my best days, when I've got the energy, I'm trying to change my little corner of it as best I can. But what if none of us live long enough to see the systems changed? What if the changes that we are privileged to see only come at painstakingly great effort and time? What if it is so slow that you and I can't even see it to celebrate it when it's happening? The only change we really notice is when we look back over our shoulders and then we see it. What if the ground which we have gained in our struggles is taken away from us and we find out that we have to regain it all again? If the system remains much the same and we have become hoarse crying out with our denouncement and indignation, perhaps what the gospel compels us to do, at least on this day, is to live in it, but to live differently within that system. If it sounds crazy when Jesus tells us to tear up that guest list, which includes our family and our friends and our wealthy folk in our lives, and instead to invite those broken on the wheels of living, if that sounds crazy, it is supposed to sound crazy. The gospel is supposed to sound crazy in this crazy world. We've been talking about movements lately. And the movement of Jesus ushers in a spirit which calls us toward radical acts of inclusion, even and especially when the system that we live in doesn't understand those radical acts of inclusion. We are called to radical acts of hospitality and love, even and especially when the system doesn't understand it or get it. Our denouncements of systems which exclude are not enough on their own. Our denouncement of systems which withhold hospitalities to strangers in our land are not on their own enough. Our denouncements of systems which devalue love as a weakness and turn hate into some kind of twisted virtue, our denouncement of those things are on their own. They are not enough. Even as those systems continue to live, and some even flourish, we absolutely must pair our denouncements with our acts of inclusion, with our acts of radical hospitality, with our acts of love, which the system cannot comprehend. Do you recall those words of Advent best heard in the King James Version? And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. So let us be busy, people of the way, denouncing if there's something we need to denounce, but let us never stop there. Let us be busy finding a place at the table for all the new kids at school. Let us extend hospitality, which is so wondrously distinct from the competitive nature of the system. Let us extend this hospitality, which has the power to lift up those who are down. Let us practice forms of love, not because that practice will allow us to live forever, but let us practice those